Welcome to Founder Stories. I'm Mike Abbott. With me today is Dwight Merriman from MongoDB. Welcome.
Hi. Thank you.
So before we jump into questions about your background and starting companies, tell us a little bit about MongoDB.
Yeah, so MongoDB is one of a new generation of database technologies that generally goes by the term NoSQL, which is actually not a perfect name, but basically these are scalable, non-relational database technologies that are new, and they're part of the big data space. And in that NoSQL space, MongoDB is the leading product there. So that's what we're doing. We're trying to kind of reinvent databases, especially on that online databases that you use to build applications.
Mm-hmm. Now, this isn't the first company you started. If we go back in time, you were a co-founder of DoubleClick.
Yes.
And I think one of the interesting things is that after DoubleClick, you and Kevin kind of started several different companies, and now you're obviously totally focused on MongoDB. But I'd love to hear, like, both about your experiences at DoubleClick and how that shaped you with your role today at Tengen.
Yep.
And then we'll come back to the kind of multiple startups too.
Yeah, I mean, my background is technical, so I started out as programming, right? I was college, so I think I learned a lot, both a little bit before DoubleClick, and then when I started it with Kevin O'Connor, who was the other founder there, and then Kevin Ryan, who I worked with for 15 years plus, is the person I'm doing a lot of stuff with now. He was there too. Mm-hmm. So I was CTO there for the first 10 years of the company, and then when it was sold, that's when myself and Kevin Ryan started some new companies in New York because we were ready to do something new.
Mm-hmm. Now, if you look, today with MongoDB, there's about 300 people.
Yeah.
Right? And you've done several rounds of financing, a little bit north of $80 million. What, from your experiences at DoubleClick, did you take or not take as you built up MongoDB? Yeah,
a lot. I think, I look back at DoubleClick, we were building all this infrastructure. We're serving 30 billion ads a day, 500,000 a second, and, you can never be down. So it was challenging, especially back in the late 90s when computers were 1,000 times slower than they are now, and when a lot of that things like load balancers weren't mature yet. So, but one thing that was challenging then technically was just the data layer, right? Because we were dealing with a lot of data, and how do you process that? How do you store it? What's the databases, and how do you scale that out? And the technologies that existed they wouldn't really scale to the levels we needed. So we had to write things ourselves, like proprietary key value stores, and use flat files for different things, and write a bunch of software basically to do it ourselves because the products wouldn't do that. So I think a lot of the sort of catalysts for a lot of the concepts in MongoDB were come out of like what I wish I had at DoubleClick but didn't have. Right, because there was a gap then, and then later, when kind of post DoubleClick kind of started these new ventures that I was working on, the same problems were coming up over and over again. It's like every time we do this, even though we're doing what one would consider best practices, we're kind of reinventing the wheel. So really wanted to see something new. Couldn't find something that I thought did that. So in the end, we decided to just start from a blank sheet of paper and start trying to build something that did that. And now it's used a lot. There's like 4 million cumulative downloads. We have 600 customers, a lot of enterprise customers.
Clearly, a lot of people
in
have
addition
that
to startups.
Yeah.
And it's also part of the goal was also to kind of do something that fits with kind of cloud computing, whether you're running in the cloud or not, just that philosophy of kind of using commodity servers, commodity networks, and scaling horizontally instead of vertically. That was part of the goal too, is something that fits that well. And also with the cloud computing, part of that is the goal there is often just to make things easier, like whether either operationally or for development, and faster, more iterative. And so we really have done a lot of work not just on scale, but equally on how do we accelerate like the delivery of applications and the velocity of that in organizations. How can you write apps faster? And that's a big part of what we're trying to do with the product.
Now, is this the first time you've been a CEO?
Let me think. No, one of the 5 companies that Kevin Ryan and myself did was ShopWiki, which a few years ago we sold. But we've been, that would be the other one. So primarily, MongoDB.
I guess the root of my question is that you were the CTO, co-founder of DoubleClick, 10 years, and now you're in the CEO role.
Right.
And I know from just my own experience, like that's not necessarily always an easy transition. So I'd love to kind of hear from you what struggles you've encountered and how have you overcome those?
Yeah. So even at DoubleClick, I was spending vast majority of my time on the tech, but I would think about the business a lot and the business strategy and so forth. So it felt pretty natural to me, that sort of transition, because of that history there. But even today, I split my time between the tech and the business side. I still write some code on MongoDB in the kernel at times.
That is awesome.
It's extremely challenging, though, to find time to do that as we're getting bigger. So actually something a few months ago we did is actually I promoted our president, Max, to CEO, and now I'm chairman and not CEO, giving me some time back to work on the tech, which had evaporated like in the last year or year and a half. So
kind of getting back.
Yeah. But I was, for 5 years at MongoDB, I was CEO and spending a significant minority of my time coding. So
I mean, as that first time, in your first time being a CEO, kind of outside that CTO role, what kind of advice would you give for some folks in the audience where it's their first time being a CEO and they've always been on the technical side?
I think the best thing would be just as if you've seen it done, right? So if you've been at another company, either as a founder or not, and you were operating at a level where you saw the CEO in action, whoever he or she may have been, and then you'll see what's involved over 5 years, let's say. And then I think, and if you're in those conversations actively too, you're going to learn what you should know, just as far as best practices, how people think about business problems, and so forth. So I think that would be ideal. I think the more challenging situation, which I did not experience, was imagine you come straight out of college and you start a company, and you're the founder and CEO because you just started it, and maybe there's nobody else there yet, right? And then you continue to be for a while, right? That's a harder situation because you haven't even seen it done, right? And it almost doesn't matter if you went to business school or were an EE major or something, because you haven't seen it done, right? It'd be a little bit better maybe if you went to business school, but so that one would be a little trickier, and I think one would need in that situation like some advisors or mentors, which might be investors, for example. But I didn't have that situation. I'd kind of seen it happening for 10 years plus first.
One of the experiences that I had was, it was one thing to go build an engineering team, but hiring sales. I hadn't hired sales people before. What did you kind of learn from your experiences with that?
Well, at DoubleClick, I was going on sales calls and, kind of giving the pitch on the technology to the people we were selling to with the salespeople. So, you do a bunch of those and you get a very good feel for how sales works. In addition to being in all the exec meetings, you talk about sales, you talk about pipelines and quotas and all that kind of stuff over time. So it's kind of going back to what I was saying a second ago about just experience, not being CEO, but being 1 degree separated. So you see all those aspects, even if you're not the person doing them.
It's one thing to understand the functional, what people are doing, but obviously interviewing a salesperson is different than interviewing an engineer. And so, like, one of the questions that I periodically get as I work with companies in and outside of our portfolios, how do you interview someone in sales from an engineer's mind? And I'm kind of curious to hear.
It's a good question, and I think for that particular position, when I interview folks, it's partly just intuitive. I think, well, one, I would look at, have you done it before? Like, have you sold software before, right? How did it go? Where were you, right? For example, with MongoDB. Or have you done open source software before, perhaps, and talk to them a little bit about that in the past. I would just look at, did they get what we're trying to do as I explain it? Because if they do, then that means they're going to be both grokking it and aligned. So they're probably then, it's a good chance they'll be successful selling it. If they've already been successful abstractly selling something else somewhere else. So that would be a big part of it. And then I would just look at something that's not functional about sales, but just are they a good cultural fit with the team, which is really important. Because if someone could be very good, but they're just philosophically going a little bit different direction. If every time you want to go east, they want to go west, and there's no right answer. It's all opinion at times, right, and subjective. It's just you're going to burn a lot of cycles just building consensus then, versus if you just got folks who are relatively aligned up front.
I'm going to switch gears a little bit. You mentioned the 5 companies you started. I think this is really interesting. So you and Kevin Ryan started 5 different, very, very different companies. Right?
Yes.
I mean, between MongoDB, BusinessInsider, Gilt Groupe, I mean, very, very different.
Yes.
And so I'm kind of curious, how did you do that? Because I think there's a lot of entrepreneurs who are like, how can I've got 3 ideas, I got 4 ideas, like how do I do these in parallel? And then now you're 100% focused on one. I'm just kind of curious, how did you evolve that, and like how do you maintain that focus actually?
Yeah, so I think what it really comes from is approaching the problem as one of entrepreneurship, right, rather than focusing on a particular domain of interest, right? I think a mistake people make at times is when they want to do a new company or startup, a lot of times they'll take their own personal interest and then they'll try to map onto that some opportunity or a problem to be solved. And that can be good if you have domain knowledge there, but there's also a risk there of sort of a bias to oneself, of lack of objectivity, because, is this really a good idea, or am I just doing it because I love, topic X, So the way I always came at it is looking for kind of unsolved problems, things people needed, kind of intersecting that with technology trends, and then trying to come up with a concept that would work. And that a good example was at DoubleClick, sort of the beginnings there. And it was actually with myself and Kevin O'Connor, the other Kevin there, kind of sitting down in 1995, and we were kind of looking at the internet as a macro trend, and then looking at, well, what's the economic model going to be for this thing? There's thousands of websites out here. Something's got to pay for them. And there wasn't an answer to that question yet. It was an open question. So we looked at, well, is it subscription, kind of like AOL, walled garden back then? Could it be advertising? There were very few ads on the internet at that point. So it was really, that was not an obvious answer. But we started digging into it. We knew nothing about advertising.
A great example. It wasn't like you had some personal interest necessarily when you woke up that morning.
Absolutely no intrinsic a priori interest. But what we saw was a problem that needed solving, and we knew a lot about half of what you needed to solve the problem, the tech part, right? So we could build ad serving technology. We understood the internet. We knew how to do that. So then we just started teaching ourselves about advertising. I mean, Kevin O'Connor, I think he went and bought a textbook on advertising and read it like that day, and we went from there, and then of course we built up a team, and that team included people over time, over the next 6 months, who knew a lot about advertising and media, because that's their whole career, and then they didn't know much about technology perhaps. And that's an example of how we got started. So we were just really looking at a problem to solve, so with no intrinsic interest in advertising per se, or like if, for example, with Gilt Groupe, once again, we kind of saw like a kind of something that we thought was both an opportunity and unsolved problem. It's sort of like there was a lot of e-commerce, like online, but it felt like there wasn't a lot of discount type channel retail online. Like Overstock didn't really catch on, for example. So I felt like to us there was a little bit of a gap there. So that was sort of how we were coming about that. We didn't have this giant hobby of fashion, for example, but we saw something that we could kind of tackle as a problem. Now I think with MongoDB it would be the exception to the pattern, where I do find that interesting as a programmer and developer. And then for Kevin Ryan, though, it would be kind of equally distant as fashion or advertising were, right? So.
Well, Dwight, it's been great to have you on Founder Story. Thank you.
Thanks.
And thank you all for watching. We'll see you next time.